Well, thank you very much for those nice introductions. I think it's my fourth time I've been in Calgary. I'm not quite sure of that, maybe the third, but on academic trips and also walking in the mountains. So it's a pleasure to be back again and in such beautiful weather. Really, I didn't expect it to be so hot, I have to say. I don't think you did either, but there we are. I want to start actually by saying a few words about Henry Friesen, who this lecture is named after. It's a real personal pleasure for me to give a lecture in his honour. He's a very special biomedical scientist, I'm sure known to many of you, both an outstanding researcher and an extraordinary scientific leader. And it's not often that both of these attributes are combined in the same person, but that is the case for him. As a researcher, he's known for his work on lactogenic hormones, and as a leader, he was president of the Medical Research Council of Canada and a moving force behind its transition into the Institutes of Health Research. So it's a real honour for me, personally, to be giving this lecture in his name, especially as it is the 10th anniversary of this particular prize. I think Henry's in Ottawa at the moment, or Toronto, one of the two. It's a pleasure to be here speaking in his honour. I'm going to talk about science and its role in society. And I'm going to cover quite a few topics, and there's no slides to entertain you. So you just have to listen to my words. And I've got the lights up high, so you can't go to sleep either. Scientific research enhances our culture and civilization. It brings about advances for society also more generally through improving our health and the quality of our lives, helping to solve big problems of the world, supporting sustainability. In fact, science influences nearly everything that we do, whether at home or at work or at play. And it is, of course, also essential to drive our economies and help us tackle global problems, such as feeding the world and having sufficient energy. And I believe it can have an even greater role in the future, improving our lives and our economies. But, and this is crucial for what I shall talk about, to achieve this requires a healthy relationship between science, politics, and the public. And that is the topic of my lecture this afternoon. First thing I want to consider is what is special about science that makes it so effective at generating reliable knowledge about the natural world. It's simply stated, it's because of the way science is done, or at least the way good science is done. It's a high calling, first of all. It's based on honesty and openness. Humphrey Davy, the 19th century chemist and inventor of the miner's safety lamp, said, "To me," and I'm quoting, "to me, there never has been a higher source of honour or distinction than that connected with science." And I think we shouldn't forget that. It's an honourable activity when properly pursued. The bedrock from which all science flows is reproducible observation, as has already been mentioned. Reproducible observation and experiment. This means that ultimately, what is observed, the data, trumps all, even the most beautiful idea, I'm afraid. We have to build on data. Scientists need to take account of all observations and experiments. They must not just cherry-pick data that happen to support their own ideas and theories. Scientific issues are settled by the overall strength of evidence, and that's critical. Often a particular idea drives what observations a scientist makes, but sometimes scientists make observations without a precise idea in mind. That isn't often so talked about. More whimsically, I call this following where nature leads you, just observing and seeing where you might go before you get driven into more conventional hypothesis science. But experiments and observations alone are not enough. It's the ability to prove that something is not true which is at the centre of science. This distinguishes it from beliefs based more on religion or ideology, which place much more emphasis on faith, tradition, and opinion. Scientists have to come up with ideas that can be challenged, that can be tested. Generating such good ideas is also not easy. It requires an in-depth knowledge of a field, complemented by peripheral understanding of related areas of science. It can't be just focused, you have to have a broad picture as well. Critical is a creative approach to come up with novel ideas which have strong explanatory power. But once an idea or a hypothesis has been generated, then you have to go further. You have to generate more experiments that need to be devised to test it even more. To test it, in fact, ultimately to destruction. That's what you have to aim at. If the result of the experiment does not support the idea, then either you reject that idea or you modify it and test that modification again. If the results of the experiments always support the idea, then it becomes increasingly acceptable as an explanation of the natural phenomenon. This is a pretty critical approach. But also implicit in this way of doing things is that scientific knowledge evolves. Early on in a scientific study, knowledge is often tentative, and it's only after repeated testing in different sorts of ways that it becomes increasingly secure. It is this process that makes science reliable, but it often takes time. And this can lead to problems when scientists are called upon to give advice on issues when the science is not yet complete. And we see this frequently. Whether a medical procedure is safe, whether foods are good or bad, particular foods. The public want clear and simple answers, and we understand that, but it is not always possible. Now, people need to understand the tentative knowledge idea of science, and the way to achieve this, we have to start in our schools, and we don't always do a good job at it. Science taught in schools is usually based, quite understandably, on the great ideas that have successfully undergone much testing. Those of Newton and Darwin and Einstein, for example. These are chiselled in granite. So we tend, or at least our pupils may tend to think, that all science is equally secure. But as I've just explained, that isn't always the case, particularly at early stages in research when knowledge is more tentative. And this view of science, that sometimes it's very secure, sometimes it's more tentative, in my view, should receive greater emphasis at school. Because it's not always possible to achieve complete certainty on complex scientific problems of public interest, yet sometimes we have to take action, and in those circumstances, society needs to turn to expert scientists and look for their consensus view. But we have to explain how all of that comes about. There are also personal qualities which are important for science. These include creativity, as I've mentioned, but also a skeptical attitude, honesty, transparency. I think courtesy in scientific dispute. I like argument, but I think it should always be carried out in a courteous manner. Frankly, though we're not always so good at this, humility and self-doubt are useful as well. The 17th century philosopher of science, Francis Bacon, famously said, if a man, and I'm afraid it's always men then, we're a little better now, if a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties. If you remember nothing else that I say, just remember those two lines. Can I say it again? I think they're great. If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts, but if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties. Put all this together, and you have a process which offers extraordinary insights into the natural world. But sometimes this work of science requires courage. And it requires courage as it can strike at the heart of accepted thinking. Challenging established opinion is part of science. And that can bring about revolutionary changes, and that can be very unsettling. For example, historically, displacing the Earth from the centre of the universe, first to an orbit around the Sun, and then to an arm of a galaxy within an infinity of galaxies, and maybe an infinity of universes too, has had a profound effect on us as humankind. It's difficult to see as the centre of such universe or universes. Evolution had the same dramatic effect, moving us from being specially created and separate from the rest of life to being related to every living organism on the plant. Darwin, Charles that is, recognised this in his Descent of Man. Man, and I quote, "Man with all his qualities, with sympathy, with benevolence, with his godlike intellect, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin." Great sentences. You only have to go to the Natural History Museum, wherever that may be in Calgary or nearby, to just see how that is true. So these ideas about the earth and the nature of humankind were once unthinkable and even heretical, but are now fully accepted, of course, by all those who respect knowledge and the power of reason. So science is a truly revolutionary process. In fact, I think you can make a case it's the most revolutionary process that we have. We tend to think of revolutions in economy or politics or ideology and don't think of science that brings about long-lasting change because of its reliable base on knowledge. And given that it's revolutionary, we have to be ready for what it might reveal. Today, for example, improved knowledge of human development and increased ability to keep unborn children alive have major implications for when life begins and, of course, also for when it ends, and for interventions such as abortion. Studies of the brain may reveal correlations between brain activity and what we are thinking, our memories, our emotional states. Increasingly, we can expect to be able to use chemicals to alter brain function, to modify behaviours. These advances have consequences. They have consequences for our views on free will, the law, justice, diversity. How much choice do we really have when we make decisions? Is punishment for certain criminal behaviours right if they are strongly influenced by that individual's genes? Will work in neuroscience influence how we should educate our children? What will we learn about genetic differences between individuals, genders, populations? How does this influence our ideas of equality? We haven't really embraced all of this in our thinking about society. And they are of crucial significance to society, but can only be properly addressed if, to return my opening statements, if we enjoy a healthy relationship between science and the public. And scientists need to identify such issues early, to encourage open debate about the implications of improved knowledge and the consequences of scientific and subsequent technological advances. These debates can sometimes be difficult, sometimes very difficult, but we have to undertake them. They have to take place. This is essential if we are to have a society that is comfortable with science and that can reap the benefits that science can bring. And science can bring and has brought great practical everyday benefits to all of us. It's always been a useful art, generating knowledge that when properly used leads to applications through technologies and engineering for the public good. Notice I said when properly used. At the birth of modern science, Francis Bacon again argued that scientific knowledge gives us the power to relieve man's estate. It's useful. Robert Hooke of the Royal Society emphasised in the 1660s how scientific discoveries, and I quote from him, on motion, light, gravity, magnetism, and the heavens, all things that interested 17th century scientists, would improve shipping, watches, optics, and engines for trade and carriage, all things that interested the 17th century citizens. Today, we face major problems in the world: food security, climate change, global health, keeping economies sustainable. All of these need science. In fact, science is critical for a healthy democracy because we need to have mature discussions about these complex issues. But sometimes these debates are threatened by a misinformed sense of balance and nearly always inappropriate headlines in the media about science. You know how it's peculiar? Often the articles in newspapers are not too bad and the headlines are terrible. You know? And that's all anybody ever remembers. And this analysis can sometimes give credence to views which are not supported by the science. We also can have problems with individuals who distort the science with ideology, with politics, with religion. Now, this isn't new. From the very beginning of science, there have been such threats. When Galileo argued that the Earth orbited the Sun, the Inquisition did not argue back with science, they simply showed him the instruments of torture. It's very important that we keep such influences separate from scientific debate, particularly instruments of torture. The time for politics is after the science and not before. That's critical. I mean, it's a bit simplistic. But when you mix up the politics with the science, you're on a slippery slope. Get the science sorted, then you can have the political and societal debates. Let's have a look at food security, ensuring the world is properly fed. This has already been greatly helped by science. The Green Revolution increased agricultural production in the 1960s through high-yielding cereals, better irrigation, use of artificial fertilizers, pesticides, all developments led by the scientist Norman Borlaug, who died a number of years ago. This green revolution is often credited with saving the lives of over 1 billion people worldwide, 1 billion people from starvation. However, in the 60s, at that time when he was advocating such changes, some environmentalists were deeply critical of these initiatives. I'm going to quote Borlaug, who said at the time, "Some of the environmental lobbyists of the Western nations are the salt of the earth, but some of them are elitists. They've never experienced the physical sensation of hunger. They do their lobbying from comfortable office suites in Washington or in Brussels. But if they lived just 1 month amid the misery of the developing world, as I have for 50 years, they'd be crying out for tractors and fertilizer and irrigation canals and be outraged that fashionable elitists back home were trying to deny them these things." Obviously straight from his heart. Now, once again, science is required to improve yields, to make agriculture more sustainable, to extend the range of crops to ecologically more marginal land. This can be helped through improving the growth of crops, assisting plant breeding by the genetic modification of plants, generating crops of higher productivity, reducing pesticide use, which can better protect the environment and biodiversity. These things are complex, of course. But let's take GMOs, which have been, of course, in the centre of this. And we need to consider what does science say about GMOs, about its risks, its benefits. And these discussions have to be uncoloured by commercial interests and ideological opinion. And when you have those two in conflict, we do not often have sensible debate. In my view, it's not acceptable if we deny the world's poorest access to ways that could help their food security, if that denial is based on fashion and ill-informed opinion rather than good science. I'm not saying whether GMOs will solve it or not, but to exclude their use is, in my opinion, immoral. Simply immoral. Another great challenge for the world, climate change. Discussions in this area impinge on politics, commercial interests, strongly held opinions, and these influences have distorted scientific debate. Solutions needed to counter global warming are likely to require more concerted world action, regulating the activities of the individual, of industry, and of the nation state. And such restrictions are an anathema to some with particular political and economic viewpoints. Equally, those of an opposite viewpoint may exaggerate the effects of future global warming because of their affinities towards greater regulation and world government. We have, in other words, politics pulling these arguments apart. This has led some polemicists to confuse the debate by mixing up the science with the politics yet again. But once again, the answer here is to focus first on transparency and good science. There's no room for preconceived ideas. First we need the science, then the politics. But unfortunately, there are some, driven by their political or ideological opinions, that mix it all up. They can be newspaper columnists with strong political views, or groups lobbying for particular outcomes, not always, by the way, revealing where their funding comes from, or for whom they may be lobbying. So these are complex issues. We have to keep our minds focused on the issues as independent as possible from these other influences. And by the way, I know it's quite difficult to do that, because we are, after all, only human beings, and we are battered by these different winds blowing in all directions. I want to turn to another issue I briefly mentioned, which preoccupies many of us, and that is our economies. Now, the Industrial Revolution brought scientists, engineers, technologists and entrepreneurs together who applied science to industry and the economy. The result was the steam engine providing power. The steam engine was revolutionary. Chemistry and geology improving ceramics and the use of natural resources. Mechanics and engineering constructing machines for transport and manufacture. I like the Lunar Society. This era is symbolised by a society called the Lunar Society. It was a group of British intellectuals, including James Watt of the steam engine, Erasmus Darwin, very colourful character who was Charles's grandfather. I recommend you read about him. He was a I'm going off message here, by the way. He was a doctor who was very charming, spoke with a stutter. He liked eating. He was so fat that he cut out an oval from his table so he could be dining table, so he could be nearer his food. He was a Republican, refused to be the doctor of George III. Wrote most of his science up in blank verse. I mean, you couldn't make it up. You just couldn't make it up. And he, of course, made a case for evolution, not a well-argued one, 50 years or more before his grandson, Charles Darwin. So that's Erasmus. Matthew Boulton, Josiah Wedgwood, of course, ceramics. And these met once a month. They discussed science, how science leads to new technologies, how inventions support the economy. They met in the Midlands, not in the great universities, in the Midlands. They were practical people. In the middle of England, once a month, under the full moon, that's why it was the Lunar Society, which could illuminate them during their ride home after dinner. Probably after too much wine most of the time too, I suspect. Now, where would our economy be without all those discoveries of that time? Where would we be without a little later electricity, electromagnetism, electronics, synthetic chemistry, atomic physics, biochemistry and molecular biology? Michael Faraday, who was the root for a number of those things I just mentioned, answered the Prime Minister of his day when asked what good his inventions of the electric transformer and generator and motor might be. Shows the imagination of the average British Prime Minister, by the way. By saying, "Why, Prime Minister, someday you can tax it." Obviously a political sophisticate. Anyway, it was probably never said by Faraday, but I always repeat this anecdote because it captures the view of some politicians and business leaders who fail to grasp how science can enhance our industrial capabilities and create wealth as well as improving the lot of humankind. So how can we make sure that science thrives and continues to bring benefits to our economy? Now, I strongly argue that the first requirement is to have a high quality, creative science base. I'm sure I have support around the room for that, so I'll say it again, a high quality, creative science base. How can that be achieved? Well, good science has a tradition of respect for empiricism, reliable observation and experiment, And most importantly, good science is carried out in a culture of openness and freedom without boundaries. The scientific endeavour, in my experience at least, is at its most successful when creativity is encouraged and there is freedom of thought. Scientists need to be able to freely express doubts, to be sceptical about established orthodoxy, and they must not be too strongly directed from the top, which stifles creativity. During the Cold War, Russia was able to build a nuclear bomb and send the first man to space. For that matter, the first satellite to space. I'm of an age, I remember seeing Sputnik 2 in 1958. It had that dog in it, Laika. And I was only 8 or 9, and I ran out in my pyjamas and tried to chase this satellite going across the sky. Just amazing. Anyway, that was Sputnik 2. But the point I'm making here, these achievements, nuclear bomb and space science, two achievements based, frankly, on previously known physics. Fantastic application, lots of solving of technological problems. But work requiring new science was not always so fortunate. Genetics and crop improvement, for example, were completely disrupted because for ideological reasons, Stalin backed Lysenko, who rejected Mendelian genetics, accepted everywhere else on the planet. Similarly, in Nazi Germany, Hitler rejected the work of Einstein because it was Jewish physics. Science does not thrive in such societies. For science to flourish, we also need a broad portfolio of research investment. We have to recognise there's a continuum of research. It ranges from what I call discovery science through research aimed at translating knowledge for application on to subsequent innovation leading to the development of new technologies. The temptation to invest too heavily in a particular part of this spectrum should be resisted. Sometimes it's argued that we should concentrate only on translation and innovation, not discovery. That is a naive mistake. George Porter, Nobel Laureate, President of the Royal Society, he actually inducted me into the society in the 1980s. He said, to feed applied science by starving basic science is like economizing on the foundations of a building so that it may be built higher. It is only a matter of time before the whole edifice crumbles. Research often needs a longer time scale than is usual with more short-term priorities of private business or, for that matter, of politicians elected on short-term cycles. And this causes problems with longer-term projects which are usually required for translating scientific advances into useful applications. So bridging the often short-term pressures from commerce and politicians with the longer times required to develop discovery research into effective applications is crucial. I think something we need to explore here is greater collaboration between publicly funded research and private companies that can help move science to application by reducing the risk that those private companies have to take. Something I think worth exploring. Now, given the argument I'm making about the importance of science in our lives, how can we make good decisions about what research should be supported? What are the factors that have to be considered when making these decisions? Well, the one I think is crucial is simply stated. It is the scientist who intends to carry out the research. Major discoveries in science are usually associated with highly talented individuals who combine a number of qualities: in-depth knowledge, creativity, understanding the values of science, how research is done, highly motivated and highly effective, in-depth of knowledge of an area but also peripheral vision. So carrying out good scientific research is a creative activity, and actually scientists have more similarities than is usually imagined with those pursuing other creative activities such as the arts, writing and the media. Scientists thrive on freedom. Organising them is like herding cats. It's completely impossible. Freedom of thought, to pursue a line of investigation wherever it may lead, to uncover perhaps uncomfortable truths are crucial to an effective scientific endeavour. A scientist whose thoughts are restrained, who is too strongly directed, or who is unable to freely exchange ideas will never be an effective scientist. Scientists also, they need to have respect for reliable, reproducible data, a sceptical approach which challenges orthodoxy and incidentally which challenges their own ideas. You have to be the greatest critic of your own ideas. An abhorrence of the falsification of data or cherry picking of data, a commitment to the pursuit of truth. Research scientists also need to be highly motivated. Often this motivation is provided by a passionate, almost unhealthy curiosity about the natural world. I'm in that category, at least that's what my family tells me, at least the unhealthy part of it. A desire to know how things work or how they can be directed to achieve particular outcomes. But other motivations can be important. A desire to undertake public good through the eradication of disease, for example, to make something useful, to create economic wealth, or to become famous. Poor fools who think that, if you're going to become famous. But some do. But whatever the motivation, it needs to be strong, because the pursuit of research, it's long and it's difficult. And given the emphasis I'm placing on the primacy of the individuals carrying out that research, decisions should be guided by the effectiveness of the researchers making the research proposal. And the most useful criterion for that is immediate past progress. Those that have recently carried out high-quality research are simply most likely to continue to do so, at least in the short to medium term. In coming to research funding decisions, in other words, the objective is not to simply support those that write good quality grant proposals, but those that will actually carry out good quality research. Some are very good at writing proposals and achieve nearly nothing. Attention should be paid to actual performance and not so much planned activities. Now, obviously such an emphasis needs to be tempered for those who have only a limited recent past record, such as early career researchers or those with a break in their careers. In these cases, I find face-to-face interviews can be very helpful in determining the quality of the researcher making the application. Too often these decisions are made by anonymous committees dealing with piles of paper, and they have no idea about the individuals that they're assessing. If the individual has no track record, speak to them. You find out so much, speak to them. So making good decisions about research funding requires a focus on the quality, passion, and past performance, when you can do it, of the scientist proposing the research. Now, a perennially vexing question is how prescriptive research funding agencies should be in determining what research areas should be supported. And this is a difficult issue. And it's a recurring issue which arises because of the tensions between scientists wanting the freedom to decide what projects they should pursue, something I've been arguing for, and society, which supports science not simply as a cultural activity, increasing knowledge, but also as an activity aimed at improving the lot of humankind through achieving specific objectives. And this is an issue, and it's a difficult one, and I'm going to make a number of observations about it. There's three issues that are relevant. The first is what we call in Britain the Haldane principle. The second is different approaches when considering programs aimed at achieving applications and specific goals. And the third is scientific leadership. Now, the Haldane principle is usually interpreted as meaning that researchers and not politicians should decide what research projects should be supported, specific ones. Politicians, informed by external advice, should decide on the overall science budget with identifying key priorities, such as specific challenges or key infrastructures, but should not be involved in the decision on specific funding proposals, which should be made by researchers using peer review. That's essentially how it's seen. Haldane was writing in the middle of the First World War, by the way, so we in Britain tend to trot him out all the time to defend the scientist's position in all of this. And it is a bit difficult trying to find the Haldane principle in what Haldane wrote, because he never actually developed the principle. we keep calling the Haldane principle when it doesn't actually quite exist. I would extend this Haldane view further by arguing more generally that decisions should be made as close as possible to the researchers actually carrying out that research. Those leading research funding bodies should focus their attention on high-level priorities and avoid the temptation to become too finely grained and prescriptive in recommendation concerning what areas should be funded. There is a danger when people become scientific leaders that they just want to prescribe everything, and it's dangerous. It's usually dangerous. Keep it broad unless you really know what you're talking about. I'm going to give you a metaphor to derive from geographical explanation. Imagine in the 19th century, let's call it the Royal Geographical Society based in London, was trying to support an expedition. And it might decide that it wants to sponsor exploration of, say, the Australian interior, source of the Nile, or the Antarctic. But it would be ill-advised to be too fine-grained in its deliberation and specify which creek in the outback of Australia, or African lake, or South Polar Glacier should be the focus of attention. That should be left to the explorer on the ground and not those in London. The funder's role should be to define the geographical region of interest, identify the best explorer, properly equip that explorer so they can be effective in the field. That research funder should behave in the same way. They should put their trust in a properly equipped explorer scientist carrying out the research rather than a committee sitting in London or Ottawa. You see what I'm arguing for there? We support the person doing the research. The committee should not be too finely grained. However, you do need to modify this approach when the research program is directed at achieving specific goals or applications. That does require more prescriptive behaviour. It differs where you are in that spectrum. Goal-directed research can occur actually anywhere in the scientific spectrum. Whole genome sequencing is an example at the discovery end where you do have to be prescriptive. You don't want every scientist to sequence the same part of the genome. I mean, that's complete madness. You do have to be prescriptive in those circumstances. However, such goal direction tends to be more prevalent when thinking about applications, translation, and innovation. And it's frankly necessary and invaluable to identify sectors which are close to application and as being areas that are worth supporting. The more prescriptive approach applies to research close to application, both for-profit activities and not-for-profit activities such as improving health and protecting the environment. So, in other words, you have to handle science differently depending on quite where it is in the spectrum. And I think some of the troubles we've had when we try to apply principles that work best at one part of the spectrum to the other, actually in both directions, to be quite frank with you. A third issue for me concerns the role of scientific leadership. If after getting good advice, a research funding leader could decide a particular research area is important and should receive more support, and the knee-jerk reaction is to ring-fence resources and have a special call. Now, I'm not sure that's the best way to do it, quite frankly, because usually you get mediocre scientists chasing where the money is, you get mediocre applications, you fund the best amongst them, and it dribbles into the sand. I actually think if the research leader is convinced that an area is good, they should actually undertake a process of education and inspiration, a word not often heard in research administration, inspiration, so that researchers become motivated to work in that area. In other words, research leaders, I feel, need to be proactive, but should focus more on educating and inspiring the research community rather than simply micromanagement of the research agenda. We want leadership. We want leadership, not simply managerial effectiveness. You need that too, but you need leadership as well. One way which I like to view this, I have to say, is to encourage discovery research, giving the freedom to the creative individual, but then have much more effective ways of capturing advances that may be of translational interest or useful for application. So give the freedom to the grassroots, but also make it acceptable for research to be then translated and make it easy for that translation to take place. Work closer to application is also likely to be more multidisciplinary and involving teamwork, including people outside science, finance, market analysis, the law, for example. We have to recognise it requires effort to get individuals from such diverse backgrounds to work well together, real effort. And attention needs to be paid to encouraging mutual respect and to breaking down the boundaries that separate them. This would be encouraged if there was much greater permeability between these sectors, encouraging the transfer of both ideas and people more freely. We need to reduce those boundaries and the barriers that are in place. One of the problems is that increasing knowledge has led to increasing specialisation, making interactions between different scientists, industry, public services more difficult. And this is a key message, I think, in this sector. The promotion of translation and innovation requires the lowering of boundaries and good permeability across all these sectors. Don't despair, I'm coming close to the end. So if you're getting a little tired, just wake up now. It's only a couple more minutes, okay? Much is spoken about the valley of death, the gap between the generation of new knowledge and the application of that new knowledge, particularly for commercialisation. And usually the focus of such discussions is on providing money to bridge that gap. But attention also needs to be paid, and if I can extend the metaphor, to pushing the bridgeheads further out into the valley from both sides. There can be a problem when attempts to translate are made too prematurely before knowledge is sufficiently reliable and complete. This is especially in the case in the biosciences, given the complexity of living organisms. Think about it. If you are here and your objective is to get to here, and that's the only reason you're carrying out your study, because you're a long way away from it, and the next experiments take you off that trajectory over to here, if you're just trying to understand, you don't care. If you're trying to reach that goal, your psychology argues always against it. And that, I think, is one of the reasons too early a translation can result in you being lost in translation. To rush into translation runs that risk of being lost. To rush into translation runs the risk of becoming lost in translation. I've got it right in the end. So we need to have a good bridgehead, but we also need to have a firmer bridgehead on the other side of the valley to be extended out with understanding and knowledge in industry in capturing that new knowledge from the other side of the valley. So when industry is outsourced to the universities or research and loses its own capability, then it is unable to recognise what is good on the other side of the valley. So we need to build both those bridgeheads and not simply think about putting money into the valley, but getting stronger bridgeheads out from both sides. I'm setting up a new institute in central London called the Crick Institute, and I want to put some of the ideas I've been just talking about in the last 10 minutes into practice there. When it opens, hopefully next month, it will house up to 1,500 scientists, and it will be one of the biggest biomedical laboratory buildings in the world. But my view of it is not just a place for scientific experiments, but a place for also experimenting in the way scientific research is done. I want to create a cultural and economic hothouse of scientific ideas, applications to make exciting discoveries, improving our health and driving our economy. And I don't want scientists to stay in their labs all the time. I want them to mix with the best minds from industry, the city, the public services, the media, to spark off new ideas, to recreate the lunar society, except not once a month and not on horses. It will be a place, the Crick that is, without departments or restricting hierarchies, with scientists free to pursue their own creative ideas in an interactive open building. Science without boundaries. If it sounds a bit like anarchy, that's because it is a bit like anarchy. It's often in mixed up and chaotic circumstances that the most creative work is done. I don't know if many of you saw the film The Third Man. character Harry Lime there said the following. In Italy, for 30 years, under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed. But they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did they produce? The cuckoo clock. Not fair on the Swiss, I have to say. If we want science to deliver, we have to have a vision to succeed. We have to promote the highest quality creative discovery research. We have to effectively capture discoveries when they can be used for societal good. If we get this right, our whole society will benefit, and it's time for such a new deal between science and society, a new enlightenment, I call it, to achieve all of these things, to encourage, cherish, and promote our science for the benefit of humankind. Thank you very much.